No, to be quite frank, postmodernity, I use quite a lot this term, but it was a stopgap concept for me, for the lack of anything better than that. Postmodernity was a natural concept to accept when one realized, as I did, after the what I call the modernity trilogy, which I wrote, legislators and interpreters, modernity and the Holocaust, and then modernity and ambivalence. After that, I realized that the categories, which were quite useful in order to analyze the virtually all aspects of human life and human togetherness, say until 1960s, 1970s, are less and less applicable to the new kind of experience, which was emerging in 1970s and became quite clear, visible, tangible about 1990s. So it was not like that. That's one thing I understood, and I felt rather intuitively, but not understood yet at that time, that we need new categories, new concepts, new cognitive frame in order to analyze what's going on currently. And it's my understanding that the duty of sociology is to be engaged continually with the changing human experience, and as it changes, if sociology is to be of any use, it should supply categories, concepts, frames, which enable the recipients of sociological services to cope with their new experience, to understand it. So postmodernity meant, to me at that time, the concept of modernity conveyed one message. It is not like it used to be. It's different, right? Hence the post. But this concept had two very essential shortcomings from the very start. I said it was a stopgap concept, and only on this ground it was usable. But shortcomings were the following. First of all, it suggested wrongly that we are on the other side of modernity. Modernity ended. And that, of course, is a very misleading suggestion, because we have never been so modern as we are at the moment. And I think that modernity has reached the logical limits of its own development. So what we have now are the consequences of modernity's success in implementing its program, and the program was to obsessively, compulsively modernize everything around, make it better, improve on, and so on and so on. However, the difference was, and it's the only difference between what I provisionally call postmodernity and modernity, is that modernity melted the solids, the extant realities, in order to replace them with more solid realities than they were. The solids inherited from the previous era were resented not because they were solid. Solidity was okay, but they were not solid enough. So they had to be replaced by some artifices constructed according to the rules of reason, discovery of science, development of technology, which will be better because precisely they will supply more solid ground, more solid basis for human planning, for human organizing their life, and things like that. The elimination of contingency, elimination of accident, elimination of fate. Fate, the idea of fate stands for something unpredictable. Reality, which the modernity was after, was a fully transparent reality, predictable, knowable. You could actually bit by bit arrive to the full knowledge and understanding, and therefore full management of reality. However, in postmodernity, this finishing line disappeared. There is no longer an end point. At some point, having modernized everything, we will arrive to the full modern life, which won't require any further change. It will be a perfect society, and perfection, as everybody knows, is a state of affairs which can't be improved on. Every further change would be a change to the worse. So in this respect, modernity and postmodernity differ, but it doesn't mean that we stop being modern. On the contrary, we are more obsessively, compulsively modern than ever before. We modernize today what we modernized yesterday. We re-modernize. Postmodernity is modernizing itself continually. And the second shortcoming was that postmodernity is typically fully negative concept. Negative concept, it says what we are not already, sometimes excessively. It implies more difference than there is. But anyway, it limits itself to saying, well, we are not already like these moderns were, our grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and so on. But it doesn't contain any positive information. So what are the distinctive features of this reality we live in? Very widely what is suggested is that we should speak about late modernity instead of postmodernity. That is unwarranted in my view. We can speak about late Middle Ages because Middle Ages are finished. So we know exactly when the late Middle Ages started. But how do we know it about modernity when we are in the midst of it? Perhaps my grandchildren will speak about this period here now as early modernity, because they will have better cognitive perspective. Retrospectively, they will understand what we can't understand. So it is unjustified concept, late modernity, on false pretenses in a sense, as if we had a cognitive perspective which we don't have. And after a lot of struggle, I selected the concept of liquid modernity. For one reason mostly, that if you look into encyclopedia under liquids or fluids, you will find out that these are substances which cannot keep their shape. They are organically incapable of keeping their shape. Even the slightest push to a glass full of water will immediately cause the change of shape. Slightest forces are sufficient in order to do that. And that is, I think, the constitutive defining feature of our reality. This inability to keep shape for long, the inability to feel secure about future shapes, because everyone is given, in our experience, until further notice. It may disappear overnight, unexpectedly, without any warning. And long-term thinking is to no avail because, it may be belied, our expectation could be belied by, as again, slightest change of terms of the game, rules of the game, and so on. Everything changes. Paradoxically, the individual human bodily fleshly life, which was always bewailed by philosophers as laughably short by comparison with longevity and stability and solidity, majestic solidity of all other realities, collective realities. Now, the individual mortal short human life is the only entity in the whole universe which has, human universe I mean, which has actually growing life expectation. because all other allegedly stable identities like political entities, companies which could be trusted because they will give you job for life, this sort of thing, human partnership, families, they all have shortening life expectancy. From one decade to another, the average length of marriage, for example, shrinks by half or something like that. The mergers between companies, the pressure which is exerted on companies to modernize all the time, causes constant change of the labor market. You enter the labor market, you are here, but you don't know what will happen tomorrow. In Silicon Valley, which is, I think, the paradise in the dreams of young, ambitious people. They would like to go there. There's where action is. In Silicon Valley, the average employment is 8 months long. So people who go there have no idea what will happen to them next year. Daniel Cohen, professor of economics in Sorbonne in Paris, pointed out that in the middle of 20th century, when a young apprentice went to work for Ford or for Renault or Citroën or whatever, he could be pretty sure that he will spend his whole professional life there and will retire at the end of it in 40 years or something from the same place. Now people who go to work for Bill Gates, for example, who is the equivalent of Ford. Ford was the symbol of commercial success in that time, and Bill Gates is now. Those people who go to work for Bill Gates have no inkling what will happen to them next year, really. That's the difference. Fluid environment, which has enormous psychosociological consequences, really, for our reception of life. Life split into episodes and projects. 2-year long project is considered to be long-term project. No one thinks in terms of project for life, what I would like to do when I will be 40 years older than I am today, things like that. And younger people will probably laugh at me if I suggested that they should now plan for life, because they are pretty happy if they have more or less reliable idea of what they will do for the next year. And hence the reticence, which is so visible today among people to commit themselves for the long term. Max Weber, as you remember, spoke about beginnings of modernity. It was guided by, it was motivated by, it was pushed by the idea of delay of gratification. I think the principle today is delay of decision. Delay of commitment. That's the only delay which we accept. Otherwise, we want everything now, immediately, instantly. But the only delay acceptable and actually favored in contemporary culture is delay of commitment. Many examples: young people graduating from the secondary school postpone as long as they can commit themselves to a particular discipline, particular skill. They would like generalized studies, which no options closed, everything possible. Because, quite rightly so, they are rational beings, and they look around and they see that skills in acquisition of which they invested 3 or 4 or 5 years, hoping that they will give them interesting and well remunerated employment. Before they actually finish acquiring them, they are already out of market because other skills are required. And another trend is preference to living together to a marriage. Marriage means taking vows, and swearing loyalty for long, till death do us part. But let's try. Let's proceed by the method of trials and errors. If it works, okay. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But if you assume from the very beginning that if it doesn't work, then you can always cut it out, then you don't make really an effort to negotiate the differences, to strike a compromise, to find mutual understanding, because that takes a lot of effort and energy. And what for? Consumer society, which is, of course, a very important aspect of liquid modernity, groomed us to expect that if you are dissatisfied with a commodity, we just return it to the shop and exchange it, or throw it away to the dustbin, the rubbish heap. So why relations between human beings should be different? If your partner doesn't fit your expectation, replace it. That's the I have developed in the most recent book the distinction between productivist syndrome and consumerist syndrome. There are two different attitudes toward life. Productivist syndrome, which was the dominant one when I was a young person, extent that colonized, in fact, invaded, colonized all aspects of human life, also human relations. And productivist syndrome tells you that if the first attempt to produce a satisfactory product fails, try harder, acquire new skills, make another attempt, sharpen your tools, this sort of thing. But proceed, by all means, proceed. Try again. Consumerist syndrome is different. If your mobile is not as good as the neighbor's mobile, you throw it away and replace it. That applies virtually to everything, to your cars, to your computers, to your house, to your partners, to everything around. We are civilization now of spare parts. Throw away the wrong part and put another one. These parts which we replace are black boxes. We have no idea what's inside. We can't repair them. Skills of repairing things are completely lost. You invite to your home even a very skillful craftsman, but if something is wrong with your appliances which you want him to repair, he will simply go to the shop and buy the replacement. He won't be able to repair it himself. So it is the whole complex. I'm telling you about that in a very scattering way because virtually every aspect of life is affected, but it all amounts to very much the same. We were modernizers in the traditional modernity by choice. Now we are modernizers by necessity. We have no other choice. The need to compulsively, daily, all the time modernizing is itself not a matter of choice any longer because of fluidity of an environment. Janina, my wife, is a wonderful storyteller. We go somewhere to lecture, then return home, and then our children come, and then Janina tells the story of our journey. And only then I know what's happened. I only then see the happening as a story, as a meaningful story. I am completely inept to do so, like she. We are very different kinds of person, really. And that's one thing which makes me uneasy about it. And the second is that I came to believe over the very, very long life, really impermissibly long, that the author is the last person to be asked about the logic of his work, because very often it comes from the author's point of view, simply from nowhere. You go to the beautiful concert, you see a celloist. Cello is my beloved instrument, playing beautifully, performing beautifully, and you leave the concert with the idea of a book in mind. How it happened, no one knows really, and I think that you can't with all the schools of journalism, of creative writing, and so on. I don't think that you can actually teach how to get inspiration, where from it comes. It could be quite contingent, quite accidental, quite unpredicted, and so on. Retrospectively, of course, you can make sense of everything. That's what sociology specializes in, by the way. It can't predict the future, absolutely. It has no tools for predicting future. All predictions normally fail regularly, but it can explain everything which happened already. That we are very good of. Once it happened, we can explain not only why, but also we can prove that it had to be like that. It couldn't be otherwise, which is debatable, but anyway, that's what we are trying to do. So retrospectively, when I look at it, I can add some logic to successive stages of my thinking. But I can't tell you in all honesty that this logic was instrumental in doing it, that it was present in my mind when I was doing it. You know, it could be done for quite different motives, and now I am feeding, squeezing into it illegitimately some motivations which were not there. And there are few points where I see clearly the impact of certain events. Well, first of all, the very fact that I have experienced firsthand the two most sinister totalitarianism in the history of humankind, that, of course, probably had formative influence on me. I was not just reading about it in books, but I was living in it, right? That the fact that I went through through the company of several different generations, each one with its own expectations, its own dreams, its own fears, and so on, gave me this compulsion to put everything I analyze in comparison with other things, you know, and see them in mutual opposition, mutual connection, be sensitive to the play between continuity and discontinuity, what has here changed, what remained the same, this dialectic of development, probably. One thing I am sure of is the impact which was made by this book, my wife's book. She wrote this book, and the product of it was the book Modernity and the Holocaust, and then successive books analyzing modernity, and then my interest whether modernity is still with us or whether it has changed, how it changed, and so on. So it was a sort of a trigger, you know, a push. Why push? Well, I knew about the Holocaust. I was not myself victim of the Holocaust. During the Holocaust, I was in deep North Russia, far away from trouble. There was another trouble, but not this one. And, so I knew all about Holocaust, as ordinary people know. I consider it for a long, long period, really, unforgivably long period, as a sort of a picture on the wall, you know, in a frame. very vivid picture, very lurid picture, but in a frame, which means that the rest of the house, rest of the wall was unaffected. So I could go on teaching about the progress of ethics and good life and so on in modernity without seeing the shadowy part of it. And when I read Janina's book, because she is my beloved wife, but also because it is very, very profound, deeply experienced report of what was happening. It, of course, was read with me with different kind, by me with different kind of attention, but also I realized one thing. Because she's very honest, she writes quite a lot about the horrors and about the beauties of human compassion, of human readiness to help, to assist, even against awful odds, and so on and so on. Because of all that, I realized that how many people actually with guns were necessary in order to kill 3 billion armless people. Right? That is a major paradox of modernity, which the result of reading this book was for me not a realization, not the common apprehension, anxiety. It may happen again to us, Be vigilant because it may happen. My major shattering discovery was that given the right social circumstances, we could do it. I saw no reason why I shouldn't, really. Ordinary people. Now, if the question was simply that monstrous things are done by monsters, well, the world will be very, very comforting, really, because we know how to deal with monsters. We have psychology, psychiatry, we can separate them from the ordinary people. We have prisons, we have police. We are defended against monsters. We are not defended about ordinary people like myself or you. I'm terribly sorry, but that's my conclusion. Also you, and we can't be sure that under right circumstances, in inverted commas, we will be participating in inhuman deeds. And that is the greatest danger in modernity, that it makes normal people able, without renouncing their normality, without renouncing their even moral convictions, but to contribute to things which are awful, which destroy people either directly by killing them or indirectly by killing their livelihood, by denying their dignity and whatever. And this is the most disquieting thing. I'm sure you remember. I'm sure you read and remember Hannah Arendt report from Eichmann in Jerusalem. She spoke about banality of evil. I disagree with that. I think it's not banality, but rationality of evil. But what I remember most from this book, and what made shocking impact on me, was a thing which is not very often quoted when people discuss this Hannah Arendt book, namely that the best psychiatrists available were brought to Jerusalem in order to investigate Eichmann. And their unanimous opinion was that he was absolutely normal. Absolutely normal, if normal, not only normal, but he was exemplary as a virtuous neighbor, perfect husband, very faithful husband, ideal father, from every, bürgerlich, as the Germans would say, middle class point of view. He was absolutely exemplary. And I even thought that if he was my next door neighbor, and we were smiling to each other, passing by every day, and occasionally playing bridge, and going to theater together, perhaps even. And I didn't know what he did in his office hours. I would never I would never have any suspicion that he may be a murderer. Now that's the problem. That's a big problem of modernity, and it triggered off many years of study, really. I think that from late 1980s until the 21st century, all these 15 years of my work was just trying to digest this lesson. So that was the formative event. Perhaps there were some others, I don't know. I'm not entitled really to be to speak authoritatively about it because I didn't make the waves very often. I was carried by. My beloved saying by Levi-Strauss, Claude Levi-Strauss, one of my selected by me teachers. I never met him, unfortunately, personally, but I selected him as my teacher, is that I don't think thoughts, he said, thoughts think themselves. And very often I have the same impression, really. So that's as far as I can go. I was born in Poland, as everybody knows, in a city called Poznań, which is the western part of Poland. Family was poor, not impoverished, but relatively poor, but very warm family. My father spent most of my conscious life, as I remember him, as an accountant, but it was a different kind of profession. Like today, accountant is, particularly in this country, is seen in the context of chartered accountants, which is a very privileged, very high-level profession. It was not like that at that time. He was hired by all sorts of entrepreneurs, and work rather not under something which you would describe as dignifying conditions. Then I was 13 years old, the war broke, we ran away to the east, succeeded to run away. That was our luck. And I spent war in Soviet Russia, far north, and then joined the Polish army, who was formed in the Soviet Union, and reconquered Poland together with the Polish army and the Red Army. When young, I decided to be a physicist, and I even managed extramural studies when I was in Soviet Russia, 2 years of physics. But when I arrived back to Poland, and it was a devastated country, it was very poor and struck by chronic unemployment and a lot of ethnic quarrels and animosities, very deeply class-divided society. But if you, on the top of it, add 5 years of foreign occupation, then you will see in what condition the country was. And it was itself a black hole. So somehow, and besides, I remained in the army for several years. I was not demobilized immediately. The only thing I could do, and the only thing I wanted to do, is to help in reconstructing somehow the country, and therefore sociology, political science, economics were the obvious choices, really, rather than physics. Physics can wait somehow. And that's how I became a sociologist. And my first school, higher education school, was Academy of Social Sciences, where we met with Janina. She studied journalism. I studied more social sciences. I don't remember even there was a word sociology. Social science was a combination of philosophy, sociology, law, and political science, a very, very generalistic sort of thing. And that's how it started. And when I was kicked out from the army during the one of many anti-Semitic purges in Poland, I joined the Warsaw University, and I remained there starting from the junior assistant to professor and head of sociology, general sociology department, from which I was for the second time purged in '68. And officially under the charge of revisionism and anti-socialist activity, which I don't accept because I believe myself to be still a socialist, really. But that was what happened. So we had to leave Poland, and that was unexpected. I was hoping to retire from Warsaw University at the age of 70, but it didn't happen like that. We left Poland, and we went for 3 years to Israel, because my wife's family was there, and she wanted to join them. I didn't last long because I was running away from nationalism, violent nationalism in Poland, and I didn't fancy become nationalist myself, as it will be a very strange medicine, more poison rather than medicine. And I got a telegram from. There were telegrams once upon a time, do you remember? Telegram from Leeds asking whether I'm interested in talking to the university. I sent another telegram, yes, I am interested, so I came here and settled for more 20 years until retirement. So I warned you, I am the least interesting subject of all I can think of. Well, that's the story. Yeah, well, that's as I say, $64,000 question, really, because you are spending your life as educator. I have spent my life as educator, and as far as I am concerned, at the end of the road, I can suddenly see that if I proceeded now, the way I proceeded when I was a young assistant and a lecturer, senior lecturer, and so on, I would probably do my student disservice, because I was still acting under the age-old presumption of every pedagogics, of every education, namely that people are like ballistic missiles. They should be set on the right course forever, until they hit the target. All depends on the kind of powder which you put there, the length of the gun, and the trajectory for the rest of the flight of the bullet will be already determined. This assumption was there. And secondly, there was another assumption that there is one given once and for all model of good life, proper life, decent life, honest life, however you put it. And the task of the teacher is to impair these virtues which combined into this model into his disciples or her disciples, students, whatever. Now, both assumptions don't hold much water today. ballistic missiles. If you look for a metaphor to describe the influence of education on human itinerary, then the best metaphor at that time, now past, was the metaphor of ballistic missile. Today it is the metaphor of intelligent missile, which seeks targets all the time and changes direction, changes trajectory depending on the moving target. The assumption of the old-fashioned warfare was that targets are staying put. The only mobile element is the bullet. So you send the bullet in order to given target and hit it. If you are good in shooting, then you hit it. If you are bad, oh well, your teachers were wrong. You know, they didn't give you the good lesson. Today it's not like that. Very often intelligent missiles are set in motion without knowing which target will be hit. They select targets themselves. Targets are eminently movable and all the time in movement, and intelligence of the target of the missile consists in a double virtue. One is quickly learning what has changed, and the other is quickly forgetting what they learned a moment ago. Because if they proceed on the ground of the information obtained split second before, they will miss the target. So that's the metaphor, which I think conveys the very essential features of the contemporary situation of educators, really, and students as well. The vulgar word to use in this context would be the postulate of flexibility, be flexible, but of course it doesn't say much. It doesn't say much. The speed with which knowledge ages today is beyond the ability of human, not to mention retention, but even imbibing, digesting. In one Sunday issue of New York Times, there is more information that the most educated, intelligent person of Renaissance confronted in the course of whole his life. Now it is one Sunday issue of New York Times which contains that much. According to some computations, in the last 30 years, humanity produced more bigger quantity of information. I'm not mentioning quality, because that's better, but quantity of information than in previous 15,000 years, which means the whole history, practical history of mankind. The last 30 years produced more information than the whole history of mankind until then. Now, how this information could be imbibed, how can it be processed? Keep abreast development of knowledge, very good advice, but how to do it? I'm writing a book. I am, of course, using the modern implements. I am asking Google, what can I learn about something? I get between 1.5 million to 3 million websites to which I should go. How can I do it? How can I do it? It's beyond my ability, not only because I am old, but even if I dedicated all my life to doing that, I wouldn't be able to do so. So how to sift a grain from chaff, how to select these few really important bits of information which are hidden in this mountain of completely irrelevant information. Paul Virilio, the French-Italian philosopher, sociologist, says that there is an information bomb which is much, much more destructive and dangerous for humanity than nuclear bombs. Because what he means, as I interpret it, is that when I was young, I was convinced that the obstacle to grasp the world, to orientate yourself in the situation, to make the right moves and so on, the obstacle to that is the absence of knowledge. I don't have enough knowledge. I must learn more in order to do that. Now I'm afraid I am thinking it's the other way around. The excess of knowledge is the obstacle. There is too much offered for us to be able to recycle it in a sensible way. We don't feel like that because we have contracted out the task of storing knowledge and the task of processing knowledge to computers. So we feel even some sort of false relief. I don't have to burden my brains with remembering things because it is all there in computer, and it is enough for me to push the right button and I will recover it. Great mistake, enormous mistake with fatal consequences. I don't know how it will end because we are in the middle of the process. But potentially it is tremendously dangerous simply because it is not true, first of all, as I said before, that this information stored in a computer is so easily recoverable, that is at hand, that it's just enough to press the button. No, when I press the button I get 3 million websites, so what can I do? So it is not like that. And secondly, that it's a different story to store information in a computer and a story in your brains, because there are, as we discussed it before, some invisible processes going on in the brain which put together information, which synthesize it, which give you suddenly shocking connections which you didn't suspect before. Now, all that is beyond us if we follow that line. So, as Americans would say, education today is an entirely new ball game, with different rules, and we are only beginning a very preliminary stage to find our innings somehow under this new situation. One thing seems to me certain, that the only education which makes sense today is the lifelong education. Now, the idea that you can settle the problem once and for all, pushing a young person through primary school, secondary school, and high school or university is suicidal, really, because it can't be done. It can't be done. That applies to both sides, to students and to the teachers, because teachers cannot rely on the knowledge which they acquired even at the best university thinkable, and even studying under the best professors thinkable. They can't rely on that simply because the every software which can buy in a corner shop will be more updated than this knowledge which you acquired in your university. So it is constant process, lifelong process for all sides of educational encounter, which is again something new. There's no canon, no quantity, no specific volume of information which you need to acquire in order to become a good teacher, and in fact it is infinite. It's and what makes even things yet more complicated is that it can't be predicted in advance what sort of information will be needed. The constant redrawing, for example, of boundaries between disciplines in the universities, the so-called interdisciplinary studies, which provide a very wide ground and fertile ground for cross-fertilization between disciplines. It means that the traditional frames of curricula, which are still by force of inertia obliging and binding in the universities, again unduly limit the ability of collecting relevant information. First of all, therefore, how to select the relevant information from irrelevant, which is flooding us. We are suffering not of the dearth of information today, but of excessive information. Secondly, how to draw responsibly limits what needs to be known in order to make a step forward really in dealing with realities. Now, these are two big questions to which I have no answers, really. I most certainly I won't find the answers too late in my life, but I think that your generation and generation which comes after you in the job of education will have to struggle with these two problems. They are, for education, as far as education goes, in my view, they are life and death problems, really, unless we resolve them. I am not sure you will resolve them. I am not sure there is a fully satisfactory solution to it. But it doesn't mean that you haven't got to struggle trying to resolve it. That is, I think, the substance of educational effort today. Thinking that you may actually prepare your students so that they can assure them that they will get satisfactory, satisfying employment. To think like that is misleading. In England particularly, there was, until quite recently, the institution called manpower resources, which they specialize in analyzing the demand of the labor market, and then through the government, universities were given targets of recruitment according to the demand for a particular profession. If there was no demand, the departments which prepared people for this profession contracted, and if there was rising demand, then on the contrary they were expanded. All predictions of manpower resources were wrong. I said before that project for 2 years is a long-term project, but here you have to make project for much longer than that, because 5 years it takes to acquire the skills, and then you have to train in job and become a really wanted employee and so on. No one can actually plan for such a long time today. It so happens I had this guilty conscience already when I was still in the university by the end of 1980s. I was preparing for my students, so I felt, for the jobs which do not exist already, which were abolished during their taking the courses in my department. And I was not preparing them for the jobs which will be there, because I had no inkling what sort of jobs it will be. So it's a constant chase, but it's a chase like, I don't know whether you have in Canada dog races, like in England, and the dogs chase a wooden rabbit, which they can never catch because it's always quicker than they are. Now that's exactly the situation of education, of of the most honest and responsible educators who really wish it as much as they can to help students in their lives, but they find it that the life is like this rabbit, wooden rabbit. It always runs quicker than the fastest of the runners. And at the same time, paradoxically, you would say that that means that the education, the whole enterprise, the whole idea is bankrupt. On the contrary, I think it was never so needed as now. It is not just a 5 years long job to train a student. It is a lifelong occupation for both sides. You can refresh your knowledge, your skills all the time, and you have refreshed your ability to give, offer this knowledge all the time. Gregory Bateson, the great anthropologist of 20th century, one of the greatest philosopher among anthropologists, had the idea of the three types of education. The primary, the most basic, was the simply transmission of knowledge, of facts, of dates, names, events, and rules, and so on. The secondary education, the higher level, that what Gregory Bateson considered to be the really important thing, is the much more difficult to organize, to perceive in full, to administer the process of offering students the ability to organize, to connect things, to see the connection between them, to analyze, to synthesize, and so on, to get some essential skills in induction and drawing conclusions and things like that. The substance here is less important than the form, the way of proceeding. But he also mentioned the third level, the tertiary sort of education, which doesn't consist, like the secondary one, in creating the matrix, the frame in which the bits of information could be manipulated, recycled, transformed, transposed, and so on. But on the contrary, the third one is dismantling the cutting, destroying the already acquired frames to accommodate substantive knowledge. Gregory Bateson wrote that, I think it was in 1960s, and then he considered this tertiary education as a pathological phenomenon. Pathological, because it was still the era of ballistic missiles, So once you acquired, he thought, like most of intelligent people of his time, he thought the normal situation, the proper situation, the desirable situation is that when you acquire a firm cognitive frame once for all, and the new knowledge which is coming should be accommodated in this frame. I am afraid that what he considered to be pathological now became the norm. The tertiary education, the constant putting apart, drawing apart the old frames of cognition, the old perspectives, constant reorganization of not only of the substantive knowledge, but also the way of recycling it and treating it and so on, is the normal condition of our times. So again, the setting under which educators need to work and the kind of services which students could legitimately expect from educational institution is undergoing at the moment a very profound change. We started talking about modernity and postmodernity. I said that postmodernity is modernity minus illusions, which it had. I would say that post-educational situation today is education without illusion. Without illusion that you can catch this wooden rabbit which you chase. You have to go on chasing, but the idea that you will eventually catch it is of course an illusion. So, and readjust the logic of our education according to this rethinking. There are books which I love, and there are books which I treat in a rather lukewarm manner, and there are books which, if I wrote them now, I would probably write them differently. But normally when I'm asked this sort of question, I'm answering in this way that with another metaphor, just imagine a room which I am entering all the time. Each time with every new book I enter the same room, the same boringly known familiar room, but each time I enter through a different door. And I owe this metaphor to Gustav Ichheiser, who was one of the most intelligent, unfortunately completely forgotten disciple of Karl Mannheim and his Sociology of Knowledge. His metaphor was that just imagine that this room I enter has several different doors, and there is an electrical switch next to every door, but each one switches lights of different color. And as you probably know very well, and every photographer would know, particularly black and white photographer, if you use filters of different color, you will see completely different structure, because it pulls out certain features of the composition and leaves in the shadow some other. And that's what I'm doing, liquid modernity, for example, this idea. I'm exploring book by book different aspects of it. Once it is the door through which I enter has the an inscription, love. In other cases it is politics. In other case it is consumerism. In other case it is fears. In other case it is production of waste, for example. So each time a different aspect which slightly reorganizes this picture. But I don't think I am good at synthesis. I'm just trying to analyze one by one various aspects of human life, and that's already mistake contained in this very idea, really, because human experience is indivisible. You can abstract certain aspects from that and analyze them in your office, professorial office, or conversing with your computer. But it is a distortion, always some sort of distortion, because you live in the shadow of some other aspects which merge completely in my own subjective living through this experience. I can't divide it into parts. So each entry is resulting in one-sided views, but one-sided in different sense. I hope against hope that if I finish with liquid modernity, I will probably give a comprehensive picture simply by adding these one-sidednesses together. So perhaps it will be a complete picture, but of course it is another illusion. John Thompson, who is my editor in Polity Press, very caring editor, and a very insistent editor, collected a few lectures which I gave recently into a very, very small book, just published. I can show it to you if you want, which is called Liquid Times, which, according to him, on his responsibility, he says it is as closely as you come to the synthesis of this image of liquid modernity. So that's the only answer I can give you, but I can't vouch for validity of what I said.
Yes, it triggered out his thoughts about the Holocaust before he, of course, knew about it, but didn't think really deeply. May I tell you a story, old story? Early in the 90s, I was invited to a secondary school in Wakefield, which is a city very near Leeds, by a teacher who responsible for English literature. She found my book somewhere and decided to make it compulsory reading for her class. Her class were 14-year-olds, 14-year-olds boys and girls, all white, all British, middle class. She invited me to school to meet them, but first I wanted to know what they did so far, and she provided me with their portfolios, 28 portfolios full of all kinds of answers to the questions, some imaginary dialogues with the persons in the book, drawings, verses, and so on and so on. A bit of a newspaper with the ghetto news and so on. And I got it, 28 containers like that, spent Easter holidays reading it very profoundly, really, very with great interest. And then I went to the school to talk to the pupils. And what was absolutely amazing, out of 28 pupils, 25 said it was the first time they learned about the Holocaust, because so far, of course, there were history lessons and they knew about Hitler, about concentration camps, and 6 million people were killed and so on, but they didn't, somehow didn't emotionally took it. It was, of course, very sorry that so many people died, but it was for them like French Revolution or I don't know, some very far events that didn't touch their life and their circumstances at all. And only 3 boys knew much more. Were from films shown on television. I took it, it was for me a great discovery. And I wrote, quite recently, I wrote a paper which I present in many countries, in many places. Just last week I presented it in Poland in a short version, claiming that the most available, but at least reliable source of the knowledge about the Holocaust for the future generation will be films and TV programs. The least reliable. To confirm it, I chose 3 films. Schindler's List, of course you know them, The Pianist, and Korczak. Do you know Korczak? Exactly. This is the case. And I analyzed these 3 films and then summed it up what the future generations, people, young people who live in 20, 30 years from now, what will they get from these 3 films? Chosen at random, but not quite at random, because all of them are by very prominent directors and tell true stories of true and prominent people. So it was not chosen quite in random. And it proved that they will learn very little. They will imagine how it looked, the genocide landscape, very well, mainly from Schindler's List. And they will learn that some people were good and some people were bad. And only Korczak was the only film from which they can really see that it was possible to resist without any hope of being solved, of being saved. It was possible to resist the evil. It was, I'm talking about it because I just recently gave this talk in Poland and I had a very strong reaction. That's why Korczak is very little known in the world, because people don't want buy this film, because what did he want? He wanted to save the self-respect of the children, and didn't save a single child, and didn't save himself. He was offered all kinds of ways to run away, refused it, and went with the children to the gas chambers. And people don't want it. Sometimes it's Dr. Korczak, sometimes it's just Korczak. Film which I don't think is a good film.
No.
But of course it shows these kinds of values. If you ask how to help the young teacher, you should advise them to show them or books and films and whatever that will catch their emotions, that they can identify. The children in Wakefield could identify with me because they were the same age. Sometimes it was funny what they said. They said, for example, poor Janina didn't have a social life because there was a curfew, but but they understood something emotionally. Only they could identify. This is only advice I can give to young teachers. It's very important. You may not believe me, but I didn't talk to them. Of course, they knew that Mama had a very hard, not childhood, because it was teenage time. And of course, she was lived in terror and had to run away and hide. And Hitler wanted to kill her. My mother was here with me, and neither she. Never. Perhaps if they asked, probably I would tell them much more. But they didn't ask, and I didn't feel need to tell them. And only when I wrote this book, when it was already typed, they read it and they couldn't believe it, and somehow blamed me for it. How could you not tell us how it was exactly?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't tell Zygmunt. Of course he knew.
Yes.
Only on one, we walked in Warsaw once when we still lived in Warsaw, and we are passing the places I was in hiding, and I told him a fragment of my story, but never more.